I saw a video a little while ago about the 7 levels of wrappers, and that made me think, we need a commander version. The commander format of Magic the Gathering is full and lush and frankly overflowing with legends that can lead your deck into victory. But not all commanders are created equal. They are created with different goals in mind, and it's fascinating to catalog which ones manage to hit their mark and which ones don't, and what forces cause those movements to even happen in the first place. Hi, I'm Joey, welcome to the Idiot Trek YouTube channel, where we use deck building data to help you level up your gameplay. In this video, I would like to contextualize the different types of commanders that make it to print, from the all-stars to the flops. For each category, I'll provide some examples of commanders to help explain and anchor the discussion. Keep in mind, while I'm doing this video, that just because a commander may end up on a lower part of the list does not inherently mean that that is a worse commander, or that being at a higher level means that a commander is inherently better. That is just not the case. Some of my very favorite commanders are in the lowest tiers of this list. What we're doing here is simply observing trends of the commander format to better understand game design ethos and to also understand general player behavior, defining the bounds of which things people like and dislike so as to improve our own deck building habits. To be utterly clear, this is a very different exercise to the brackets system, and these classifications have altogether nothing to do with and should not be construed with the apparatus of brackets or game changers. Where the brackets seek to help align player intention to help create opportunities for more enjoyable gameplay, here we are simply interrogating card design and commander popularity as a means of furthering our understanding of how certain decks even come to be in the first place. A commander at level 7, according to this video, could still of course be built as a bracket 1 or bracket 2 deck, and a commander that I label as a level 3 might still be great as a bracket 5 CEDH deck. Keep in mind that as we move through the levels, we're simply categorizing certain types of legendary design, and we're tracing their perimeters to properly map out their impact on the format. There is not a threshold that suddenly makes you move from one category into another. It's not as though if you reach rank 500 that will suddenly move you up into another level. That's not how this works. There is significant overlap at every single one of these stages, and in fact, many types of these commanders may even exist across the entire spectrum. That is a bit broad, but we do have to paint with some broad brushes here since we are trying to get a general layout, a general map of how the commander format works and how its movements are shaped. And not only that, but we are also combining a lot of different types of analyses in this video. We are looking not just at why a commander was made in the first place, but also whether or not it succeeded, and if so, for how long. That is the general shape of things that we're trying to do here, which does mean combining lots of different variables in order to try and come to a conclusion. If you like what you see, consider subscribing and checking out our other videos for even more data and insights. And with that, let's jump into the list. We start off at level 1, the lowest on the ladder. These are, simply put, the draft chaff legends, things that can technically be your commander, but which are not ideal in that role, and most importantly, were never intended to be. And the numbers reflect that. These commanders are basically fated from inception to never crack over 100 decks to their name in the EDH Rec database. Think here of Spider-Man Webslinger, Prismatic Piper, or Skoa Embermage, a commander that I actually built and that I do indeed play. Link to all of my decks in the description. These cards were not designed to entice you to brew around them. They actually exist for the sake of limited environments, 40-card formats such as Draft and Cube. The fact that these creatures are even legendary and therefore eligible to sit atop as the leader of a commander deck is almost an afterthought or an accident, but there are small reasons governing that decision to make them legendary. For instance, named characters in Universes Beyond sets, such as Spider-Man, are of course required to be legendary because that intellectual property doesn't want you thinking that their signature character is just any old common. Oh no, they're special. Skoa is legendary because of the tension that creates with the grandeur mechanic. Prismatic Piper exists expressly to grease the wheels of Commander Legends Draft, just in case you didn't wield the legend that you were hoping to pick up and play. These technically could be your commander types of legends, may feel like they used to be few and far between, but truth be told, they are not an entirely new phenomenon. The set Legends and Homelands gave us Tobias Andrion, Jasmine Boreal, and Chandler. The older Kamigawa block cultivated a Legendary Matters theme amidst its 3 sets, thus painting legendary status onto otherwise unremarkable cards such as Iwamori of the Open Fist, or Kodama of the North Tree. All creatures technically usable in the command zone, but their use in Commander would have all of the impact of a bigot flinging gay slurs at me and my husband on the street. Negligible, barely a whisper on the wind, and you mostly just feel sorry for them. For commanders of this categorization, not only have a lot of players forgotten that these cards are even legendary, you'd frankly be forgiven for forgetting they even exist in the first place. The greater tone I think is important to express about commanders at level 1, their defining trait, is that fully building any one of them as a dedicated commander deck is almost an act of defiance or stubbornness on the part part of the person who's piloting them. When I built SCOA, I did it to prove a point, to take a thing that was not meant for the Commander world and to try and make it work there anyway. People playing Prismatic Piper are frankly kind of doing it to troll the table a little bit, tongue pressed firmly to cheek. This doesn't mean that the entire deck will be bad, but it does highlight a certain playfulness with the requirements of the Commander format, and you can tell that the person who's playing them is giving a bit of a wink to the audience. While so many other legends have text boxes that offer considerable value engines, or that demonstrate diverse possible brewing pathways, or even that drop hints to intrigue players and invite them to consider just how you might actually brew around those abilities, commanders at level 1 require you, the brewer, to get into the driver's seat and manually haul them to a location that would make them interesting or even playable in the first place. They are tuned for another world and would be utterly bamboozled to find themselves in the supersized environment known as Elder Dragon Highlander. Commanders at level 1 are Diplo blocks in a Lego bin, pieces of an entirely different puzzle. But at the same time, who doesn't love a rascal trying to make Barktooth Warbeard work in Commander? That brings us to the commanders at level 2, the 99ers. Commanders of this classification have a lot of similar traits to the previous level, namely that their status as legends is also usually somewhat incidental, but what separates them from the level 1 commanders is that they are actually quite popular. We regularly see them on tables and in games. We just don't often see them leading the decks that those players are using. I call this level the 99ers because these commanders are often referred to as better in the 99. Think here of commanders like Padim, Consul of Innovation, Captain Vargas Wrath, and perhaps even Nils Discipline Enforcer. Commanders of this category might reach up to 1,000 decks in the database or so, but the most notable thing about their data is that they are often 8 to 12 times more common as a card in the deck rather than leading one themselves. Take Jin-Gitaxias as an example. 800 decks to his name, but nearly 80,000 decks where he's included as a supporting cast member. This very well may be the most populated category that we'll discuss today. Legends of this nature have frankly exploded in commonality over the past couple of years, as Wizards of the Coast recognized the power of marketing to a Commander audience and started to wield that knowledge in a way that was simultaneously more purposeful and more haphazard, and began to give out the designation of Legendary to more and more cards in every single set, with some sets containing upwards of 80 legends, compared to Bast sets barely having 10. Even though not every single one of these creatures will end up as a compelling deck leader, they represent a massive shift in design as Wizards adapted into taking a scattershot approach to try and catch your attention with as many different cards as possible, to make sure that you don't ignore any of these cards like you normally might, to cause that millisecond question of, what would that deck even look like in the back of your mind, just in case one of those types of cards happens to inspire you to pick up a little bit more of that product. The most common version of this type of commander is often found in Universes Beyond sets, and especially in Universes Beyond precons. Think of commanders like Fandaniel from Final Fantasy and Danny Pink from Doctor Who. Again, named characters from other IP are obviously going to be legendary, but compared to the level 1 commanders, at least these have effects that make sense in the context of the commander format. However, compared to many of the other types of commander categories that we'll get to in a moment, these level 2 legends rarely manage to stand out as being particularly unique or offering effects that are so intriguing that you just ache to find 99 other cards to back them up. Their effects are good, but they share more in common with the sorceries, artifacts, and enchantments that already exist in your deck, fulfilling those support roles. Another important quality that these commanders share is that they are almost always monocolored, or at most 2 colors. They were made to play a supporting role in other people's stories, and therefore limiting their colors helps them to slot into more possible decks. They can't be too many colors because that would restrict their ability to show up and flesh out a draft archetype or the theme that a precon is trying to create. This is, however, exactly what curtails player interest in building around these legends in the command zone, since we know from a single glance that their available card pool will be significantly limited in comparison to their contemporaries. As we'll see in later commander categories, more colors often corresponds to more popularity. Not always, but often, because of the increased flexibility that having a couple extra thousands of options in your potential card pool would provide. The defining feature of level 2 commanders is that they were created to support another legend, or another archetype whose commanders just have broader reach than they do. When you play commanders at level 2, you will almost certainly get the question, why not just play insert name of another commander here? They are in many ways literally NPCs, just one animal that exists within a vast ecosystem, rather than being at the top of the food chain themselves. That's really the name of the game here. A level 2 legend is part of the support system rather than being the beneficiary of it. I want to reiterate that commanders at this level are not bad or uninteresting. The label of a level 2 commander is not a condemnation, simply an acknowledgement of the intent behind why these cards were made that way in the first place, and why they flicker but don't catch fire. To use a personal example, one of my newest decks is Avatar Kyoshi, which has barely 500 decks to her name right now, compared to the other Earthbending legends that have anywhere from 3,000 to 17,000 decks. Avatar Kyoshi isn't popular, she's overshadowed by many other legends, but does that mean she's no good? Not at all, she's one of my favorite decks to play right now. My colleague Dana's Tavash deck could also stand in as a great example here. It constitutes barely a drop in the ocean of cards that care about life gain and drain. It's the kind of thing that's really easy to overlook. But when given proper attention, it's a really fun deck to play and to play against. Level 2 commanders are fun cards. They were simply designed to blend in, rather than to make any waves. But that won't stop some of us from giving them a chance anyway. With that, I think it's time we move on to the next category, level 3. Here we're talking about niche. These commanders exist on the fringes, never even ranking amongst the top 1,000 commanders in the format. These are the hipster legends, commanders that you've always wanted someone to build around, but that you may not always feel ready to take a chance on yourself. Some excellent examples of level 3 commanders would be Moira Brown, Guide Author, Noyan Dar, Royal Shaper, or Thalen of Havenwood. Each one represents a fascinating place to explore, but when you begin to explore them, you discover that their pool of cards is actually rather shallow. In the case of these examples, quest counters don't have a lot of cross synergy for Moira to make use of. Animating lands is better supported in green than in Noyan Dar's Azorius, and the fungus cards that Thalen aims to support are interesting, but few in number. That challenge of filling out the full 99 without the deck just devolving into good stuff turns many players off to instead go explore other areas. But the handful of folks who remain and who do their darndest to try and make these commanders work anyway, they've got some of that hipster energy. Given the original video that inspired me to make this one, I'll use the metaphor of music here. These are your indie artists. No mainstream support, never even a radio hit, but the small fan base that they do manage to acquire is fiercely loyal and hungry for more. The line between level 2 and level 3 commanders is probably the fuzziest of all the categories that we'll be discussing today. After all, some might call it a hipster move to play the previously mentioned level 2 Captain Vargas Wrath as your commander, and fair enough, the word hipster has a very informal and colloquial usage, and I wouldn't say that the use of that term is in any way false in that context. Hipster players probably build a lot of commanders at both level 2 and level 3. But we're not talking in this video about classifications of players, we're talking about classifications of commanders. And the distinction that I think makes Legends at level 3 stand apart from the previous section, the line that I think is important to draw here, is that these commanders do not function fantastically in the 99. These commanders were expressly designed to do their own thing, not to blend in like the Legends at level 2 do. Of course, the problem they face, and a detail that differentiates them from level 4 commanders, which we'll get to in a moment, is that the thing level 3 commanders would want to do lacks the benefit of a pre-existing support structure. Where Vargas Wrath could theoretically be a pirate commander but is more often supporting other Izzet and Grixis legends, a commander like the new Chong and Lily Nomads doesn't and won't show up in the 99 very often at all. Level 3 commanders challenge you to make a deck around an archetype that is either so new that it doesn't have a lot of support in general, or one that has next to no support in its own colors. Chong and Lily actually makes for an especially good example here. Not only are there not very many mono red bards, but the Saga card type in general has been given a much greater amount of support in nearly every single other color besides red, making this card ineligible to join Saga decks such as Narcy, and unable to benefit from synergies that other Saga decks enjoy, such as Enchantress payoffs that are more common in green and in white. Building these commanders is an uphill battle, a quality that I also mentioned is true of the level 1 commanders, but unlike the commanders at level 1, these legends here at level 3 demonstrate a very clear reward on the other side of that challenge if you manage to persevere. That is the defining trait of a level 3 commander. If you can make it work, you know exactly what the payoff will be. The simple question is, can you actually make it happen? Can you actually manage to KO someone with a Trot of the Silencer? Will you be able to flip Jaren the Corrupted Bishop? What will the Blind Seer's color-changing ability do to the board? The inherent tension of those questions is exactly what makes level 3 commanders so exciting. For that reason, we must obviously give our flowers to commanders such as Phage the Untouchable in this categorization as well. Her rules text makes it very hard to pull off in Commander because of the nature of the command zone, but if you can find a way around it, the entire table will cheer. She is actually an exception to the traditional deck count limits that I would expect for a hipster commander, having actually cracked into the top 1000. But I think she's the exception that proves that rule. And she still contains those niche fringe or otherwise hipster elements of embracing a significant challenge and refusing to take the easy road simply to enjoy the status of being not like all those other decks. And that is exactly why we love these types of commanders. Commanders at this level create gameplay patterns that invite the entire table to lean forward. They forge a collective interest where everyone gets invested in whether or not you'll actually be able to make the thing happen. Now, of course, I can't discuss a hipster section without again citing my colleague Dana, who famously sets up camp in this type of area. If you saw the recent Extra Turns episode with me and Dana, you'll have seen his Val and Haunted One deck, which is a perfect example of a level 3 commander, a deck that he built precisely because he wanted to try making blue-black wizards care about combat damage. I highly recommend checking that game out, by the way. It was a wild time, but you should finish this video first, and probably like and subscribe while you're at it. Like I said before, the difference between level 2 and level 3 commanders is the hardest to distinguish, but the reason that I've saved the classification of hipster commander for level 3 instead of level 2 is because these commanders meet the criteria of not just being somewhat countercultural and avoiding the mainstream, but also because of their cutting-edge potential. A hipster commander is not merely one that is unpopular, but rather they are all about carving out unique spaces. They attempt to make a strategy work with far fewer tools than anyone else, and once again, they don't fit into just any deck the way that a level 2 commander might. But what's most interesting about commanders at level 3 is how they exist in a dichotomy of not having a support system, but also not wanting one. Nothing would ruin the thrilling experience of a Selenia drain my own life total and exchange it with yours deck faster than Wizards of the Coast printing an Orzhov life exchange precon helmed by a brand new version of Selenia. That is the unfortunate reality though. Level 3 commanders are at enormous risk of becoming obsolete, of being overwritten by a bigger save file. Bosch the Iron Golem was outclassed by Imskir, Mistform Ultimus was outranked by Orvar. Even Chisei players are probably looking at Owaka and going, hey, what the heck, that's my thing, despite the fact that Owaka is a level 2 commander through and through. Getting new toys that happen to work really well in a deck is one thing, but getting supplanted is another thing entirely. If Wizards of the Coast started to cater too directly to players that enjoy this brewing style, it would probably end up feeling like watching your favorite indie band turn into Maroon 5. This is what I mean by the paradox of level 3 commanders having cutting-edge potential. Those legends as commanders are in some ways ahead of their time. They were the ones drinking matcha lattes and wearing distressed jeans before it was cool. But when you're playing the hipster, in real life and in Magic, you must always stay wary of your favorite thing becoming more mainstream. I don't think it's quite to the level that these are endangered species necessarily, but they are the types of things that you have to watch out for. And they also tend to be some of the most fun decks to see across the table. I would really love to hear from all of you about your favorite level 3 niche fringe hipster decks if you want to leave them in the comments below. Okay, now we're at our level 4 commanders, the things that I am calling a one-hit wonder. In terms of popularity, they can exist across the entire spectrum, but generally speaking, here we're finally at the legends who are hovering around or have crested over the rank of 1000 and who may even potentially go up as high as rank 400. I know that that sounds like quite a spread, but the reason for that is because of how tumultuous and crowded a space it is when you leave the fringes. Plus, this also happens to be the level of commander with the most mobility and the highest amount of variance about how legends wind up in this space in the first place. These are your Nikias, your Brunas, your Abominations of Llanowar. In the world of music, these artists had one good song, one really good song, but they didn't have good albums. The Rembrandts will be there for you, Los Del Rio taught us all the Macarena. Culturally, we have heard of these things, but you often have to be reminded of who the artist is, and you'd have to go out of your way to think about them. When you present your deck to the rest of the pod, commanders at level 4 and below are often met with sounds of recognition and phrases like, oh yeah, that one. To my eye, there are 3 ways that a commander might end up here at level 4. In the truest sense of a one-hit wonder, the first way that a commander might end up here is by being basically a flash in the pan. They burned bright but fast and eventually faded. Not into complete obscurity, but certainly they didn't have the stuff to maintain what initially looked like very promising velocity. We've actually done a whole episode on the rise and fall and relative build rates of commanders over the years, expressed as a heat map that tracked when players began and stopped paying attention to each individual legend, which I highly recommend checking out. It's one of our best episodes. Link will of course be in the description. The trajectories of commanders like Prime Speaker Vannifar, Emil the Blessed, and Arami of the Deadtide are illustrative of exactly this point. Players saw these legends, got really excited to brew them, began tinkering with the decks, which was extremely entertaining to do, but then once they had played a few games with these decks, that turned out to be enough. They got to make the thing happen, and that turns out to have been all that they needed to see. So these commanders' rapid growth stalled out, but they still remain floating in the atmosphere at a low orbit. Flash in the pan isn't the only way that commanders get here though. To illustrate the second way that a legend may arrive at level 4, I will submit my own Yannette deck as an example. She was never anything special on arrival, she simply offers a relatively unique ability in the command zone in her colors, cheating odd mana cards off of the top of your library, and inviting you to consider how best you can use the top of your deck to your advantage during gameplay. She debuted among many other commanders of the 2019 precons, like Aminatou, the deck's much more famous leader, and of course also in the deck was the juggernaut known as Yuriko the Tiger Shadow, who really stole the spotlight from everyone that year. Yannette didn't have the benefit of fanfare. You could maybe even accuse her of riding Aminatou's coattails, but her ability is inventive, charming, and enough to justify a mild accumulation of attention that she's still been able to sustain going on 7 years now, keeping steady at just above rank 500. Commanders like this don't aspire to dominate the format, and that's exactly what happens. They don't. And that's perfect. To be honest, it's one of the best places for any type of commander to be. Playful, innovative, but not overexposed. And the third way that commanders may wind up at level 4 is by exploring a very well-known space. Unlike level 3 niche designs, which don't have format-wide support for their fringe archetypes, these level 4 commanders have the opposite problem: too much support. Brightpalm and Stefan are probably some of my favorite examples here. Brightpalm entered into a +1/+1 counter space with some actual powerful abilities and a whole format's worth of cards to improve this deck if you wanted to, but it's hard to stand out in a field that is already this crowded. Stefan also got an entire precon to show off his stuff, full industry backing from the entire system, but he is still ultimately playing vampire dance music, and even if we haven't heard these exact tunes before, we all still know the drill already. I don't even mean that as a dig. I actually love Stefan as a piece of design because he attempted to cater to the higher costing vampires, which actually is an original take since vampires have historically been so low to the ground. But even so, he's still ultimately walking the safe hiking path, not blazing an entirely new trail. Unlike the legends at level 3, who tried to do their own thing without the assistance of a full toolbox, these types of commanders at level 4 had all of the preparations they could ever have possibly asked for, but that network of support is also precisely what damns them. When I try to come up with one word that defines all of the various types of commanders that arrive at level 4, the thing that comes to my mind is the word solved. Now, this can be a bit of a harsh word in the world of Magic, so hear me out and I promise to proceed with caution. Solved as a term implies that the commander has been fully explored and has nothing more to offer us, and for some commanders at level 4, that can indeed be the case. A common characteristic of level 4 commanders is the way that they cause you to engage with set releases in sort of a binary way. For instance, Verazal decks care about kicker cards, and only kicker cards. So whenever you're looking over new sets, the equation mostly boils down to, does the set contain kicker spells? Check yes or no. And that's about it. For some, especially folks who love to operate in the level 3 spaces, this phenomenon can be a little bit frustrating, since they may interpret this as being a bit of commander on rails. I personally think this area is where we started to see some players begin to throw around that age-old accusation of EDH-Rec homogenized commander. And while I do think there is merit to some pieces of that type of argument, I think it is also important to look at commanders such as Narcy Fablesinger and critically ask whether you think EDH-Rec is the reason that Narcy players run a lot of sagas, or is it maybe that Narcy literally gave us a script for her to follow? Maybe that's a better word to use than solved. Scripted. These commanders arrived with a firm outline to follow, a set of pre-written character beats that must occur like you're playing a character in a murder mystery party game. Make sure to tell the maid about Miss Valentine's money troubles before we move on to Act 3, you know? This is why I don't necessarily think of solved as an inherently negative quality for every single commander at this level. Instead, I think of each of them as having completed a pretty satisfying story. They had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you know what? I'm just happy that the author knew where they were going instead of Game of Thrones Season 8 us all. Commanders in this category were given a path to explore, a direction to go, and that's exactly what they did. It just turns out that that direction is mostly capped. Their ability to even become solved in the first place is exactly the thing that both helped them and now hurts them. They can go exactly this far, but no further. And that's okay. As I said before, not every commander should aspire to be the number one. These commanders aren't crowd pleasers, they aren't even popular, but neither are they niche. They simply require a specific taste, perhaps even an acquired taste. They're not for everybody, but the people who know they like it are going to love it. Now, most notably for commanders at level 4, they may often end up so predetermined in their plans that it ends up being hard to make them do anything else. They are good commanders with clear rewards, but they are on average deeply inflexible. Abomination of Llanowar is hard-pressed to do anything other than sit atop an elf deck, you know? And even when you do find versatility with a commander, that versatility also still has a limited scope. My mom's favorite commander, Arrington Giada, either cares about flying creatures or flash spells or a mix of both. That is a rigid version of versatility. I can go left or right or up or down, but my rotation point is still fixed to this one specific axle. If we were to liken this to character customization screens in video games, this would be more like making a Wii avatar than it would be like making a character in Baldur's Gate 3. Simply put, innovation at this level requires force. If you want Commander X to do strategy Y, you have to pick it up off of the Hot Wheels track and place it onto a new road yourself. But as a result of that, this is the category where we get one of my favorite types of commander deck. Since innovation requires force, this is where we get to see a lot of popular commanders given hipster makeovers. For instance, building Rigo's Streetwise Mentor as a mono-white deck instead of accepting all possible colors in his identity. The truth be told, this kind of deck building challenge that players can engage with happens at every single level. I've seen a mono-black Oloro deck, for instance. But this here at level 4 is where we begin to see those ideas begin to grow and have a real chance to come into their own. Taking a popular commander and purposefully putting it into a gear that it was never originally intended to operate in is always a delight to witness. It's possible that some of my descriptions of level 4 commanders have come off as dismissive or flippant, so let me again reiterate that I adore this category of commander, because I think that this is an area where we get to see a lot of interesting experiments. Wizards of the Coast makes a lot of compelling designs, but we as players only have so much deck building energy, only so much attention economy, only so much money to put into throwing a new list together, and often the biggest and brashest commanders in the room suck up all of the oxygen. We've done whole episodes before showing how in some cases the top 3 or 4 commanders of a set might end up with just as many decks as the other 20 or 30 plus commanders in that set combined. But those 20 or 30 other commanders are really worth exploring because you find such fascinating ideas there. A new take on high-cost vampires, an attempt to make the top of the deck matter, or a deck that's in white-green Blink instead of white-blue Blink. Still keeping one foot in Blink's primary color, but just trying something out to see whether or not it sticks. Every commander at level 4 comes with an interesting story. After all, look how many different pathways they could have taken to wind up at level 4 in the first place. Level 4 legends are in a very interesting playground, and while I understand that super niche and obscure commanders like the ones at levels 1, 2, and 3 aren't for everyone, I do think that every player should at some point try out at least one level 4 commander deck. Commanders at levels 5 and 6 and 7 are great, and we'll get to them in a moment, but I think you become a better player when you give level 4 commanders a chance. With that, we move to level 5, and the name I've given to this section is Notorious. Expect most of these commanders to exist probably around rank 5 or 400 and upwards. I know that notoriety sometimes has a dangerous connotation, as in we know you for something bad, but in this context I simply mean that we are now reaching the commanders that you've definitely heard of. Many of them are classics: Omnath Locus of Rage, Marchesa of the Black Rose, Yidris, Derevi, or for a personal example, my very first deck, the Mimeoplasm, which I still have together to this day, is absolutely a level 5. These commanders didn't just have one hit song, we stuck with them for multiple albums. Many of them are old guard commanders, like good old reliables. Often these commanders exist within the top 5 of their color combinations, but they're not usually the number 1. They might have been at one point or another, but they don't hold that position and keep it. Many level 5 commanders possess a quality that every level 4 commander lacks: true versatility. However, they also lack a distinct quality that is possessed by level 7 commanders, spoiler alert, and that is routine, consistent support. So what do I mean by this? Well, where level 4 commanders were pointed in exactly one direction, I am a kicker deck or I am a flying deck, level 5 commanders are not quite as honed in on a singular destination. Kaikar is open-ended enough to be built as a spellslinger deck or a dedicated storm list, but I've also seen it built as a polymorph deck or even a cool vehicles commander. Brutaclad works really well with mirrors or copies or treasures or clues. This isn't to say that level 5 commanders can't can't operate within niche strategies, the rank 279 legend, Kadena, cares about face-down creatures, which is a pretty strict space after all, where many of the cards will feel pretty obvious whether or not she's going to want to play them. But even if her deck and exact card choices may feel that way, that doesn't mean the way that she plays is on rails. Two Kadena players with the exact same deck list could still play her in completely different ways. Unlike commanders at levels 1 and 3, which must streamline themselves within an inch of their life to even stand a chance of working properly in the ring, and commanders at level 4 who have no choice but to move in exactly the way that they were programmed, commanders at level 5 get to take the scenic route if they want to. They get to enjoy the journey, either in deck building or gameplay, or both. However, they don't always receive consistent support in every single set. Most sets will probably have something that they could use. Any set with good equipment or good knight cards will make Sir Gwyn players perk their ears up after all. But this is not a consistent, common experience. To be honest, preview season for level 5 commanders has got to be the most annoying out of any of the levels. Xenagos and Tuvasa players, for instance, must scour through every big beefy creature and every single enchantment in a new release to see whether there's anything that they want to use, and that's quite a big swath of cards to look through every couple months. However, those decks and those players usually have something in mind that they would want to see, so they can often tell pretty instinctively whether any new card is actually going to make the cut and be worth it or not to buy. Importantly, these commanders don't run the risk of becoming supplanted, of another commander coming in and knocking down their family-owned restaurant to build new condos. My favorite example of this is Rurik Thar. Rurik Thar used to be the de facto werewolves commander back when that creature type didn't have any actual compelling legend to lead them. His ability facilitated at least a little bit of their possible flipping back and forth between day and night. But when Tovolar came out and gave all of those werewolf players a bespoke, handcrafted home that also came with a carefully written "I'm sorry it took me so long" apology note, what was to become of Rurik Thar? He survived just fine. He's currently rank 396. He pivoted to being a classic Gruul bruiser. Lots of big creatures in the deck, lots of punishment, with even a small hint of Voltron capability sprinkled here and there across his deck data. As another quick example, consider Sidisi Brood Tyrant, who was arguably usurped by Teval the Balanced Scale, which has extremely similar abilities. Sidisi is still rank 261 though, past her prime, but still beloved, and players who like her appreciate the ways in which she is still different than that newcomer, and that they still wish to brew around instead of just ditching her altogether. Also, some commanders will wind up at level 5 by simply being the most powerful within a niche space. Okaun and Zindersplit are not the only coin flip commanders, but they are one of the most exciting. However, no matter how good they are, not everyone is going to flock towards the deck that requires that much coin flipping, hence their reason for not being able to sustain super popularity across a long stretch of time. Examples like Rurik, Kadena, and Okaun are important to demonstrate the difference between level 5 commanders and the elite top-tier level 7 commanders that we'll get to later. Commanders at level 5 are still susceptible to trends. They won't be knocked off their pedestal by an influx of new cards and fresh-faced new commanders, but they are not immune to them either. The bottom does not drop out for them if a newcomer moves into the territory. They are versatile enough to share the space, but their dominance is not taken for granted. And just because they can share the space does not mean that they will remain at the top of the heap when the dust settles. Players must continually renegotiate their relationship to these commanders as new sets change game dynamics in small and large ways. I described a lot of these commanders as an old guard before, but I think that's actually the most important aspect to discuss, their quintessential feature. These commanders' heyday exists in the past tense. What we celebrate about them is a former glory. I don't mean to say that they peaked, because that sounds far too diminutive for what I'm describing. These commanders are not and never were flash in the pan. Former glory is still glory. They kept us interested and engaged for years and years on end. But to love a level 5 commander almost always means looking backwards instead of looking forwards nowadays. And this goes for the designers just as much as it goes for the players. Humorously, this class of commanders is the one that is most likely to see repeated versions of the character. Tristani was so beloved that she got 2 new versions that frankly are both pretty mid. Marchesa later became a queen and then a cowboy for some bizarre reason. Some newer versions are flops, but a few managed to showcase the character's evolution in a new and mechanically compelling way. We should still absolutely respect respect our Elder Dragons and recognize this rank for the awesome achievement that it is. Level 5 is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of dignity, of aging gracefully. These commanders once paved the way for others to follow, but the format no longer moves around them the way that it used to. We respond to them now with affection more than with inspiration. That affection is extremely well deserved. It is hard to become a level 5 commander, and as we'll see soon, this level is actually the landing pad for many big names. These commanders have gotten their due. They had stretches as the number 1, they lived extremely fascinating lives, and even though they're not particularly poised to ever do that again, we have to applaud them for a job well done. With that, let us move now to the commanders at level 6, the ones that I call the Rising Stars. New blood, with an undeniable velocity, these commanders didn't just climb up the ranks, they took off like a rocket blast. This is where we find Y'shtola, Tival the Balanced Scale, Vivi Ornithir, Ms. Bumbleflower, Firelord Azula. These commanders are the new hotness, simply inescapable, the topic of conversations at many a game night, each one of them surging into the top 100 with alarming speed. Even Firelord Azula, who has only existed for a few months, is already well on her way to cracking the top 40, and Y'shtola is already ranked number 6. As I was writing this video and looking for a real-world comparison to analogize these commanders, the name that sprang to my mind here was Chapel Roan, already a powerhouse of a performer with many hits under her belt in a pretty short amount of time. But whether that energy will maintain itself during future album releases remains to be seen. That's the case for these commanders as well. Valgavoth became the number 1 most popular commander in Rakdos after its release at the end of 2024. But will it weather the storm? Can it even survive another Rakdos precon taking off in popularity in the future? After all, look what happened to Prosper, the prior rising star and new hotness of Rakdos. Prosper was among the top 20 commanders in the years after his release, but he has since slid back down to now be the 5th most popular Rakdos commander, firmly cementing himself as a level 5 legend nowadays. Do I think all level 6 commanders will suffer the same fate? No, I don't. I think Y'shtola, for instance, really has what it takes to stake it out and become a level 7 commander, which we'll get to in a moment. But it has not yet been demonstrably proven that she will sustain that interest, because it can't be. She's too new. She hasn't had to fight to hold her place yet. She made a grand entrance, and that is absolutely noteworthy. Please do not interpret any part of my analysis as disrespect or diminishing of that accomplishment. It is simply that these types of commanders are not time-tested, and we cannot take their current positions as an absolute, definite reality for the entire rest of their existence. Their popularity does not come with an asterisk, it just comes with a question mark. Will they hold? Can they hold? That's what really makes for a level 6 commander. We're all still keeping our eyes on them, holding our breath to see whether or not they've got what it takes to really shift the landscape of commander on more than just a temporary basis. So if these commanders can't sustain their placements and do eventually fade, why won't they count as flash-in-the-pan legends a la level 4? Simply put, it's because of the heights that they manage to reach. They manage to crack not just the top 100, but sometimes the top 30, the top 20, the top 10. And importantly, they stay there for months on end, if not a full year, or 2 years, or sometimes even 3, unlike the flash-in-the-pan commanders whose longevity is best measured in a handful of weeks. Plus, the distance that a Rising Star commander could eventually fall isn't particularly detrimental or reputation ruining. As a case study, let's take a look at Feather the Redeemed. She was the hotness, not just any old commander, but a full-on conversation starter that made waves because of what it represented. At long last, a standout amongst the Boros Legends formula, which at the time suffered from a seemingly inescapable trend of exclusively combat and equipment-focused offerings in desperate need of some proper, or really any, innovation. Feather broke a boundary and absorbed all of our attention. But then, in the years after that ceiling was finally shattered, she settled back down, no longer needing to take on the role of Juggernaut and no longer carrying the weight of expectations for an entire color combination. She now sits comfortably outside the top 100 and is still one of the top 3 Boros commanders, though narrowly. This is the quintessential journey for a Rising Star level 6 commander that doesn't manage to stay at level 7. It makes a wave, it sets a trend, it shapes the conversation around itself. But if 3, 4, 5, 6 years on, it turns out that that's not actually quite enough fuel to keep you at the top spot the entire time, you get to politely float down to a place in the format where you are remembered fondly for your contributions, and probably also for being such a powerhouse in your glory days. To make sure I state it outright, level 6 is unlike all of the others because it is temporary. Places like level 4 or 5 or 7 are ending destinations that commanders rarely move out of once they land there, but commanders cannot stay in level 6 long term. The whole point of level 6 is precisely that it is transitory, ephemeral, a liminal space, a place that legends go to await final judgment, and then see where they will move on next. Level 6 is a proving ground, a popularity purgatory. It takes years to figure out which level 6 commanders could eventually become level 5s and which ones might have the stuff to make it to level 7, and I'd be very curious to hear from you which current Rising Stars you think do have the stuff to stick it out and become one of the all-time greats, and which ones you think will follow in the likes of Feather or Prosper. I personally think that maybe Y'shtola's got the sauce, but I have my doubts about Vivi, Firelord Azula, and Miss Mumbleflower. Let me know your opinions in the comments below. And finally, that brings us to the last category, level 7, the GOATs. Adraxa, Ur-Dragon, Kalia. We all knew this was coming. These are the titans of the Commander format, and to think of Commander at all means to immediately conjure one of these names to mind. In the world of Commander, these legends are Madonna. They're the Beatles, household names whose impact on their genre shifted cultural conversation. They are the Meryl Streeps of Commander, universally acclaimed and unquestionably accomplished. If every Commander were to suddenly become a Muppet, this is where we find Kermit and Miss Piggy. Divas, stars, icons. They didn't chase a trend, they created the very sandbox that we're all still playing in, and we still feel their impact to this day. Not only have these commanders occupied top spots as the most built and most popular commanders of all time, commanding tens upon tens of thousands of decks, but they have maintained those positions for years on end with very little threat to their reign. EDHREC tracks the popularity of commanders that have been built or upgraded within the past 2 years, so as to make sure that new data trends, new cards, and new legends are not constantly fighting against like 15 years of deck history and therefore never get a chance to actually stand out. After all, the format has evolved a lot even in just the past 1 year, so a 2-year window allows us to see trends such as the lightspeed rise of Firelord Azula for the accomplishment that it truly is. This is also part of what causes the phenomenon of level 6 Rising Stars and level 5 former mainstays in the first place. And yet, despite that 2-year window, the level 7 commanders still reign supreme. Players do not build and then forget these legends a la level 4 or 5. No, they routinely keep these decks updated. With each new set release, deck building energy will of course surge to the level 6 new hotness, but after that dust settles and that excitement quells back down, if you go back to the EDHREC pages showing the most popular commanders built this week or this month, invariably, without fail, these are the commanders that will climb right back up to the top in a record time. It is nigh impossible to unseat them. When was the last time that you saw Edgar Markov outside of the top 10? Have you ever seen Krenko Mob Boss dip below rank 15? These commanders are not shiny new blades, nor are they long forgotten rusty swords. They are well-worn battle axes that still see regular use and whose owners love them enough to make sure that they stay regularly polished. Commanders of this nature benefit greatly from having hit upon fan-favorite and quintessential fantasy archetypes: dragons, angels, goblins, elves. These are the very things that we expect and frankly hope to see in our fantasy card games, and you can't imagine such a game without them. This also has the added benefit of making sure that nearly every set release will contain a couple of new cards that will appeal to these commanders. Not every single set will give new toys to a life gain player, but it is downright difficult to find a set that doesn't have a dragon in it, or a set that doesn't have a card that Atraxa would at least consider proliferating, you know? In many cases too, these commanders were the first of their kind to mark the territory, falling into the classic game design trap where the first entrant into an archetype winds up being a little bit more powerful than the designers meant it to be, and which naturally draws in eager players like a moth to a flame. Indeed, whenever you teach a new player EDH and they start getting interested in going to build their own deck, these are the kinds of the commanders that they're almost certainly going to end up tempted by first. Crucially, commanders at level 7 are characterized not just by their longevity and popularity, but also by their downward influence on all card designs that have come afterwards. Designers cannot simply make another ninja commander, they must do so under the auspices of Yuriko the Tiger Shadow, whose shadow indeed looms large, and who almost certainly will subsume any new attempt at making a ninja commander into her own deck rather than sharing that territory. Whenever you build a 5-color commander, you as a brewer inevitably find yourself asking, why am I not just using Kenrith? You probably have a great reason to not use Kenrith, but the question still pings in the back of your mind at some point because these commanders are simply so good and so versatile that you cannot help but feel them breathing down your neck just a little bit. In fact, some of them are so strong that they can fit atop a deck that's trying to pull off a weird strategy or niche archetype in the 99 with complete ease, and they may even sometimes do the job better than the dedicated niche commanders that were intended for that strategy will do, which can be very frustrating. When players refer to these commanders, it is often often with a queasy combination of adoration and exhaustion. Admit it, you yourself have at some point felt the gravitational pull to try your hand at building at least one of these commanders. And not only have you most certainly played against each and every one of them before, it's actually quite a challenge to find a group or a game store without at least one person that has one of these decks in their roster. I said before that we can't even really imagine the game without these commanders, and I'd like to return to that point to really highlight their importance. If a commander at any of the other levels were to receive a ban, that would generate buzz and plenty of internet discussion. But if a commander at level 7 were to receive a ban, that would run the risk of generating not just buzz, but controversy. Their absence would constitute a dramatic shift and force a reevaluation of the game for each and every player, even the folks who are not playing these commanders, simply by dint of the sheer size of the vacuum that they would end up leaving behind. Asking myself what would end up filling that vacuum, where all of that deck building energy would go, what the domino effects of that would be, is such a daunting question that frankly I struggle to answer it. When I ask myself what is the defining feature, what does it really mean to be a level 7 legend in the commander format, the anxiety that suddenly creeps into my mind is that of power creep. These commanders aren't just untouchable in their popularity with players, they are also, hopefully, untouchable by the very game designers who made them. If Edgar Markov were to be unseated by a new Vampires commander, we all intuitively know how awful for the game that would be. We pray to never see a more powerful Elves commander than Lathril, because any new Elf commander that could unseat Lathril would be unreasonable and unhealthy for the format. If another generically powerful 5-color commander came out that threatened to unseat Kenrith the Returned King, it would clearly have to be so overpowered that it would almost certainly need to be banned before things could get to that point. And indeed, that's exactly what happened to Golos Tireless Pilgrim. He was on his way to dominate the format, and before his reign could actually solidify, he was nipped in the bud, because if it wasn't done then, it would have been significantly messier to try and extricate him from his throne later. That's just how these commanders operate. Their roots run deep. Becoming a level 7 commander is not and should not be the aim for every single legend. There is, after all, only a small number of spots that can exist at the very top of that ladder. And frankly, I also just count us lucky as a player base that Wizards of the Coast does not regularly aim to try and outdo and unseat the current titans of the format. They've certainly printed some legends that hit a lot harder than expected, which is how many of the level 7 legends got here in the first place, and plenty of designs nowadays are also intentionally juiced up to appeal to as wide of a crowd as possible. But thankfully, there is not a significantly high degree of rotation and turnover at these topmost spots. In fact, to call any variations in these commanders' placements a mere shift is to mischaracterize the moment completely. Movement along the ladder at levels 1 through 4 are kinda negligible, barely a blip on the radar, and movements up and down the ranks for level 5 and 6 commanders are expected. They represent really interesting surges, waxes and wanes, and noteworthy trends in the way that players are engaging with the game. But those are an entirely different thing to level 7 commanders. Changes in status for commanders at level 7 are no mere shifts. Their movements are tectonic. The fact that Atraxa is no longer the #1 commander and has now been eclipsed by both the Ur-Dragon and Edgar Markov is itself the kind of thing that players simply cannot help but find remarkable. That's what these legends are. Remarkable. Their endurance proven by years of tenacity, fully expected to withstand the tests of time. Level 7 commanders don't write in pencil or in pen or even in permanent marker. They are tattoos that the format will carry forever. And those are the 7 levels of commander. Draft Chaff, 99ers, Niche Hipsters, One-Hit Wonders, the Notorious, the Rising Stars, and the Titans, greatest of all time. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe to the channel for even more deep dives into the fascinating format known as Commander, and until next time, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.